Shalom, dear friends. This is April 20th. This is Rabbi Schoenberg at the Jewish Center, and we're going to study today Yigdal by several different poets, but it's based on the 13 principles of Maimonides. So good day, everyone. Good morning. Enjoy your lunch. Enjoy your coffee. I have some coffee. It's from Princeton. So it's locally sourced, as they say. Okay, so tell me why you're here. What do you want to learn about Yigdal? And then I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do. What would you like to learn today and the next 3 weeks about Yigdal? And I know there are a couple of people who can't be here today, but are going to join us later. What would you like to learn about Yigdal? Feel free to unmute. Everybody can unmute. There are not so many people. You can unmute.
Interpretations of the meaning.
Okay.
I would like to get some background on I know it has to do with Rambam's philosophy, but I'd like to hear more about that background and, kind of the big picture.
We're going to do the big picture today. That's exactly what we're going to do today. Okay, good. What else?
I'm curious about the whole idea about having a creed. And I know that there's controversy about it and who accepts it and who doesn't and all the other ones that came. Somehow I don't know enough to know this, but I just feel like it's somehow at odds with other things I know a little bit about Maimonides. Just
Great, yes,
seem like
very accurate. Yes, we'll do a lot more of that in the second session, and I'll explain what Avi means by that in a moment. Yes, great.
I'm also, as Jerry, I'm interested in that historical context and how it's evolved.
Okay, great. Okay, good.
I'm interested in the poetry and understanding the meaning of the prayer.
Okay, great. So we're going to be here for about 3 days to cover all of that material, at least. So here's the way I'm going to break it up. Today, I'm going to do the background. I'm going to do the historical context, the philosophical context. I'm going to talk about Maimonides' 13 principles. I'm going to talk about dogma, and does Judaism have dogma? Next week, we'll start the principles. We won't finish them. So we'll do that on the third session as well. And when we have what we have left, we'll look at the poetry. So in essence, here's the short summary of it. There were 70 poems written to summarize Maimonides' 13 principles. The Yigdal that we have is just one of 70. We'll get to explain why that one won out on the third session. Today, we're really going to do philosophy. So I'm going to answer, I hope, 3 questions. Does Judaism have dogma? Right, Avi, that's your question. Does Judaism have dogma? The second question, if Judaism has dogma, is the Yigdal or Maimonides' 13 principles the dogma or not? What's the dogma of Judaism, if there is one? And the third question is, why did Maimonides feel compelled to create the 13 principles? For the moment, let's call it a creed. And at the end, you'll decide whether it is a creed or not, but it is the 13 principles. What compelled him to do all of that. Okay. That clear? Okay. So Maimonides, what we call Maimonides' 13 principles, which obviously has a life of its own as a document, was originally in Maimonides' commentary to the Mishnah. When he got to the Mishnah for Masechet Sanhedrin, the 10th chapter, the first Mishnah. So understand that Maimonides wrote 4 books, 4 major books, working in reverse chronological order. The last one was a medical textbook. It was a medical textbook meant to educate doctors. It was a bestseller. Nothing original. It was a textbook of other people's material, but in Maimonidean fashion, he organized it so well that it was a bestseller. The next to last book was the Guide to the Perplexed, Moret Nevuchim, which we did a few weeks ago. Before that, it was the Mishnah Torah, his classic work of halacha. As a young man in his 20s, he started life by writing a commentary to the Mishnah. What else did he have to do? He just knew it by heart, and he wrote a commentary. Other people had written commentaries. When he got to the 10th chapter of Sanhedrin, to the first Mishnah, he took a distraction. He went on an excursus. That became the 13 principles. That became, and it is known as Chelek. And you'll see why in a moment, because that's in the text of Sanhedrin. So if you hear people talking about Chelek, and you hear them talking about Maimonides, we're talking about what Maimonides had to say on the 10th chapter of the first Mishnah. And Chelek is short for Chelek B'olam Haba, portion in the world to come. Who gets into the world to come and who does not? That's Chelek. Okay, so now let's look at the starting point. Before we look at his commentary, let's actually read the Mishnah for Sanhedrin, chapter 10, verse 1. And this is what it's all about. Right? So just to summarize again, if we go through this, we're going to start with the Mishnah. We're going to look at what questions it raises, look at what Maimonides had to say about it. That will become the 13 principles. And then we'll eventually get to the poem that's the rewriting of the 13 principles, what we will call Yigdal. That's all the steps. That clear? And this is, no, Harriet, what's your question?
No, please go on. It's not entirely clear, but that's the point of your discussion.
Well, let me put it to you this way, okay? When I was a college student, this is a true story. It's one of my favorite stories. When I was a college student and I studied medieval Jewish philosophy at Brandeis, I had a final exam. My final exam asked me questions about Maimonides' 13 principles. In order to answer the question in my head, in my final exam, I sang to myself, Yigdal. And I got an A on my exam. Yigdal is a poem written 100 years after Maimonides. He had no idea about it. It's a poem. So there are 3 steps. There's the Mishnah, which gave rise to lots of questions, which led Maimonides to write a commentary on it, which became the 13 principles, which eventually became the poem. Okay. Is that clearer, Harriet?
That was perfect. Please continue.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right. Barbara, let's share the screen, please. All right, Jerry, do you want your old job back? Jerry, why don't you unmute and read, please?
Hebrew or English? English, I guess.
Do you need me to enlarge it? Is it large enough? I mean,
Yeah.
I could
Yeah.
enlarge the type and show less. Do you want
No,
it?
it's fine, it's fine. You want me to read English, right?
Please.
Oh,
All of the Jewish people, even sinners and those who are liable to be executed with a court-imposed death penalty, have a share in the world to come.
Stop. Stop. All of the Jewish people, not just the rabbis, not just the elite, not just the special people, everybody, even if they have sinned, have a share b'chelek b'olam haba. They have a privilege to get in. Now he just brings a proof text, which is very typical. Well, the Mishnah brings a proof text. Go ahead, please.
As it is stated, and your people also shall be all righteous. They shall inherit the land forever, the branch of my planting, the work of my hands, from my name to be glorified.
Okay, this doesn't add anything. It's just a proof text. Okay, please go on.
And these are the exceptions, the people who have no share in the world to come, even when they fulfilled many mitzvot.
Okay, let's stop there. All right, now he's going to tell you that there are 3 groups that don't make it in. 3 groups. The Mishnah is going to tell us 3 groups. Okay.
One who says there is no resurrection of the dead derived from the Torah, and one who says the Torah did not originate from heaven, and an Apikoros who treats Torah scholars and the Torah that they teach with contempt.
Okay, these are the 3 groups. That's all we're going to do here. These are the 3 groups. If you deny Mechayei HaMeitim and say that that's not from the Torah, one who says Torah did not originate from heaven, meaning it did not come from God. And this was what was unclear. And an epikoros. So the Mishnah has a Greek word, and that was unclear. And Maimonides then said, okay, that needs further explanation. And that led him to write down the 13 principles. Because epikoros was a Greek word, and it wasn't clear what it meant. That said, okay, Darshani, that needs an explanation. Let's stop there for a moment, because epikoros, what continues there is what people had who treat Torah scholars and the Torah they teach with contempt. Now, that doesn't sound so horrific, does it? Right? Because Maimonides thought it meant much more about that. Maimonides ultimately held that an epikoros was someone who denied divine providence, which is what I'm going to talk about come Shavuos. In other words, that God doesn't met out punishment for the wicked and reward the righteous. Ultimately, that's what it could say is an epicurus. But all I want you to see here is that the word epicurus is a Greek word, says this needs further explanation. Does that make any sense to you?
Well, I thought it was a name, but I won't get into it.
No, it is a name. It's a name of a Greek philosopher. Yes. Totally yes. It's the name of a Greek philosopher, which says, why is it here? This is unusual to be in the Mishnah, to have a Greek word. What I really want you to see is that it's a problem, that it's not clear.
So, but,
Go ahead, go ahead.
well, but it's not a problem to say that you could have the death penalty imposed on you and still go to heaven. But as long as you believe that, in the divinity of God, it kind of doesn't matter what you do on earth, which is very contradictory to everything I've understood about.
Well, good. So if you were Maimonides, you would say, I have to explain that. I mean, the point is, and this is what we need to understand about the Mishnah, is the Mishnah is usually apodictic. It's very short. It's a sentence which says, I need explanation. That led rise to the Talmud. Right? It's clear and it's unclear. Right? And the fact is that it could mean so much more. And that's what led Maimonides to go into explanation. All I want you to see from this, Nancy, is the Mishnah clear? No, the Mishnah is not clear. That's the point. Maimonides said, okay, I'm going to explain it. And as opposed to 2 lines of commentary, he wrote an excursus. Okay, you could stop the screen share. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about dogma. Judaism have dogma. So the first question is, we are not the Catholic Church, obviously. We don't have one central authority. We don't have one central rabbi. We don't have one central place. We don't have one central court. That's in fact why rabbis are Mara Da'atra, that every rabbi has the right to make their own halachic decisions. The more learned the rabbi, the more they know, the more they can make decisions. There isn't, and that's why, that's the beauty of Judaism, right? Right? But it's not just about actions, it's about thought. The founding chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, Solomon Schechter, his name went on to become the Schechter Day School. That became his nickname, right? The Schechter Day School was the original chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary. He wrote a very famous essay about dogma, and he said in it, a life without guiding principles and thoughts is a life not worth living. So he argued that there should be a dogma. It would be a question of any self-respecting religion. It should have a dogma. Doesn't mean it does, but he argued that it should. So now a little bit about context. Remember that Maimonides was in Spain, and when he was originally in Spain, it was Christian Spain, and then it was invaded by the Almohads of North Africa, and they began to spread Islam throughout the Iberian Peninsula. They were very successful, both as military warriors and religiously. And one of the contributions that the Almohads had is they had a creed for Islam. So it was in the context of a successful conquering of Spain that the new governing power, which had a different religion, had a creed, taught the religion by means of a creed, and asked people to swear that they accepted that creed. So it was out there as something that was going on. Third, even though Maimonides was a halachist and wrote the Mishnah Torah, he was a philosopher. The question of Sanhedrin, chapter 10, verse 1, is a philosophical question. Who gets into the world to come? I want to know. I want to know if I'm going to get in. Barbara, I know you're going to get in. I don't know if I'm going to get in. Right? Myra, your work for the Shiva meals, that's going to get you in. Right? I don't know whether I'm going to get in or not. I want to know. Maimonides wanting to know what gets you in. A philosophical concept.
Just want to say that this is assuming the concept of a world to come.
Fair enough. Yes.
And that to me is a major, I don't know, philosophical question.
Yeah, Maimonides would like that question.
Mm-hmm.
Maimonides would love that question, actually. You don't know how good a question that is, Myra, because Maimonides will later argue in the Guide to the Perplexed that such a physical description of the world is untenable. So that the world to come is not a physical place. It's an intellectual ideal. But we're not there yet.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, to go and do that. So Maimonides was reacting to the question of the immortality of the soul, and he did not want it to be based purely on the Aristotelian answer of the philosopher Aristotle. He wanted to provide a Jewish truth to that. Maimonides is also answering another question. The other question Maimonides is answering, if there is no belief, why are you observing mitzvot? Why should you observe mitzvot?
Because you've got an alternate, creed. Because you think that our creed is we need to be Mamlechet Kohanim and Goy Kadosh. We need to be holy.
Avi, that's great. Avi, terrific. Right on. So the next question is, right, going back to your core question is, there was already a creed, or was there a creed, right? And yes, and Jewish philosophers and historians say, and by the way, right, that's this week's Torah portion. Right? It's this week's Torah. It's exactly timely for this entire conversation. Yes, be Mamlechet Kohanim, be a holy people, whatever that means. And I love that question, right? Yes, or Shema Yisrael. Right, and Shema Yisrael takes you through 3 paragraphs, accept God, love God. There's reward and punishment is the second paragraph. And the third paragraph as a theological statement is not about tzitzit and mitzvot. It's got the word in the next to last line, Avi, kadosh, right? So you can argue we already have a creed, or earlier biblical Jews certainly believed that they had a creed, right? Maimonides took it to a whole other level.
And I'd even say that, even implicitly before, when you said that Barbara and Myra get in because on the strength of their good deeds, then that's Hillel and Akiva, about your neighbor and just being a good person. But, maybe Maimonides kicks them out because they don't accept the world to come or resurrection or any of the other ones.
Right. So, right, which raises a whole other question. What happens if you have doubts and questions? Nancy, you look like you got doubts and questions. I like that.
No,
right?
I was just agreeing with what he said, because that's kind of right, yeah, it's like, so you have all of this, but then you don't accept or you question resurrection or all those things, and then you don't get in. So it's kind of,
Right. So let's be clear. Let's be really clear. Maimonides said, if you question, you're out, folks. Which is, by the way, one of the super reasons why this was highly controversial. Because Maimonides took the radical step and made the radical sentence, no doubts, no question, absolute belief. Nachman of Bratslav said, let's see if I can find you the quote.
in this version, are non-Jews allowed into heaven or the world to come?
He doesn't deal with it here. He does not deal with it here. Nachman of Bratslav said the following about Maimonides, right? So you're talking about 18th century. Nachman of Bratslav said, Maimonides will be considered a great philosopher, but in the future, it will be known that he is a heretic and an unbeliever, because Nachman said, ask the difficult questions. So Nachman of Bratslav called Maimonides a heretic. Okay.
And can I ask, I know this is a digression, but so this is what he wrote, you said his first book in his 20s. Is this the writing of a young man who wants and looks for absolutes, and later on as he matured, did he discount this and say, does he write things that in the end say, you know what, I was, maybe doesn't explicitly say, but maybe he says, I was a young man looking for absolutes and now I'm wiser?
Oh, terrific question. Terrific question. Okay, so this was his starter book. Okay. He wrote a halachic work, and he wrote the magna opus of philosophy. He had ample time to correct, to amend, to change, to rewrite exactly what you had to say. Okay? And one of the things that we're going to look at right now is when it comes to the Mishnah Torah, he doesn't repeat it exactly. And in the Guide to the Perplexed, he also doesn't repeat it. He could say, I refined it. Here are the 13 principles. Let me clarify. He doesn't do it. So let's ask the question, why? Okay. So so let me ask you this question. If Maimonides had the opportunity to reteach it and rewrite it, if he was writing and remember, he's the clearest writer we've ever had. He was a gifted writer. Why did he not say, okay, I've now had another 15 years. Let me give you the beautiful final draft. If you ask the question that you did in the beginning, is this a creed? Why did he not rewrite it?
What do you mean by rewrite it?
Well,
You mean, why didn't he modify, or why didn't he reinforce what he originally?
why didn't he reinforce it?
Because I don't think,
Well, I'm asking the question. Is this a creed? Is this like, here is, look, Maimonides knew everything, right? Remember, this is long before the internet. He wrote down 15,000 halachot in the right order. He knew everything. He could have rewritten his 13 principles and said, okay, now I'm in the Mishnah Torah. I've come to the section in Sanhedrin where we're going to talk about Olam Haba. Let me spell out to you the principles. He does 5 out of the 13. He doesn't do 13. Exactly, let's see. In the Mishnah Torah, 5 of the principles of the 13, he does, what's 5 for 8? So in the Mishnah Torah, he does 8 of the principles and not 13. When he gets to the guide to the perplexed, similar, he does another 8 and not the same 8. So I don't want to drive you crazy, but if he meant to say, here is my perfect creed, I'm promulgating a creed to you, maybe that wasn't what his intention was. We call it a creed. Other people call it a creed. Afterwards, they go and say, oh, here's the creed of Judaism. But that was not his intention. He did not set out to say, here are the 13 principles. You want to know what you need to believe? Here it is. That's not how he started out.
So you're saying,
Folks later said, oh, this sounds like a creed. I'll make it into a creed. And then they put it into the prayer book and everybody memorized it. So they knew what to say as a Jew, what to believe. But that's not how it started out.
so are you saying in his, well, but on the one hand, you're saying that he said, he's an absolutist. And on the other hand, you're saying that he didn't mean everybody to take it as that? You know what I'm saying? Like you,
No.
because you're saying he states things extremely strong.
Right, Maimonides never goes any place halfway. Right, he's a polemicist in this. But let's look at the principles for a second. I'm going to answer your question the long way around, Nancy. Okay. I'm going to argue that he didn't set out to be a creed because he doesn't repeat the 13 principles in their entirety. He had ample opportunity to do that. There are other excurses in his commentary. There are 5 other times when he takes these long, distracted, philosophical conversations. It's not the only time. He says, this is something we need to look at. He was his style, and when you study the Mishnah Torah, this is why it's so clear. He says, here are the 4 principles of culpability for transferring objects from private to public on Shabbat. He tells you, I'm going to give you 4 principles of things you can't move from outside the Eruv to inside of the Eruv. I'm going to give you 4 principles, and then he gives you 4 principles. About leverage marriage, he says, here are the 4 principles of leverage marriage. So he says these things. It's a language, the way that he talks, to sort of organize how things, to go and do that. He also contradicts in the Mishnah Torah, when he talks about these same beliefs, he says, it's not if you think it that you don't get in, it's that you need to say them out loud. So he actually changes his stance. Because if you believe it, but you don't believe it, okay. But if you say it out loud that you don't believe it, that's when you don't get into Olam Haba. To go and do that.
Can I ask a question related to that?
Hold on, hold on one second, because I want to get, this is my way of answering Nancy's great question. The last part of it is, there are things that you would think would be a core principle that are not in the list. And the biggest one that's missing from the list is that God created the world. It's not in the list. So it's not, or that the Jews are the chosen people, for example. So there are core Jewish beliefs that we talk about as core Jewish beliefs that are not in. So again, to answer the question, Nancy, if he started it out as a creed, he didn't do a great job. I mean, he says you should believe these things, and if you don't believe these things, you don't get in, but he left out the creation of the world. Every place else you look, that's a pretty core principle. It had a life of its own. Once he wrote it, and once people read it, they said, this is terrific. And they began to accept it. Right? And we're going to talk about his life. Okay, so I'll pause there for a moment. Okay, yes, Avi.
I mean, can you argue? So Maimonides was supremely arrogant, and he seemed to have two sets of ideas about the kind of people there are. And there are elite people who are wise and learned and can understand really deep philosophical thoughts. And then there's everyone else. And he seems to believe that there are certain things you say or you do because you're going to confuse the common people, and they're going to go astray. And so you leave them with certain things that are not really true, but if you don't, they're going to get into worse trouble. And you know, could you argue that some of these things that you're talking about have to do with that in effect, he's saying, yeah, people, the regular people, they need a creed, they need these kind of simplifications. And I know something better. I'm not going to say it out loud, but those of us that are learned and really study and are philosophers, we understand a deeper, some kind of deeper truth.
Yeah, that's not a bad argument. And I would say that's called Morei Nevuchim. Yeah. Yeah. He's saying you should believe these things. They're important, but the ultimate question is it the list? That's what we're going to get to now. Is it the list? How is it received? Put it out there. So you're Jews. Here's a Jew who put out, said something. Here's the creed. How do you think it was received? You think he had any critics? You think anybody offered another opinion? Right. So, first of all, let's look at the type of criticism. There are essentially two types. One, from such famous people as the medieval Spanish philosopher and Bible commentator Abarbanel, and 19th century Orthodox Jewish philosopher Samson Raphael Hirsch, said, yes, Judaism has a creed. It's all 613 mitzvot. It's everything. You need to believe that the 613 mitzvot represent the fundamental principles of Judaism. In essence, they were arguing there was no dogma. There were those who said, yes, Judaism has a dogma, but now there's a whole literature of what's the dogma? How many principles are there and what's included? Some offered 7, some offered 3. There's a whole literature to talk about who's in and who's not. Let me just give you just one example. There was someone by the name of Rabbi Joseph Albo, 1380 to 1445. That's essentially 200 years after Maimonides, right? He said there are 3 principles, not 13, but 3 principles. His 3 principles: belief in God, belief in revelation, belief in reward and punishment. And he was a pretty good competitor to Maimonides. Like Maimonides, he was a very good writer, very appealing. His principles were very popular. So again, they argued there was dogma, there is a creed, but a lot of conversation about what's in and what's out.
Who was that person?
Albo, A-L-B-O, Joseph Albo. There was actually those 3 were pretty popular, right? There was someone by the name of David Ben Yom Tov Bilia. He added in creation. He said that's what's missing from Maimonides. So there were a lot that did 3, and very often when they did the 3, they added in creation ex nihilo, creation. So a lot of conversation about, does Judaism have a creed? If it does, what's in it? How many principles to go and do that? That was a large conversational, a long and lengthy conversation in the Middle Ages. Yeah, Jerry.
A couple of things. First of all, I think there may be a trend among people who state dogma that the statement of dogma is meant for other people, not necessarily for themselves. That might be a kind of a general rule of thumb.
Say
And I
what
think
do you mean by that, please?
I'm not sure that he necessarily believed in these things. He just thought it would be a good idea for people to believe in these things and to demand it of people.
Oh, okay. I would add to that that's Maimonides as the educator.
Right.
Nice.
The other thing, I went to a yeshiva for 9 years, and one of the guiding principles that I think I gleaned, especially in my last year from my most ultra-Orthodox rabbi, was that what you believed deep inside was really not very important. It's what you did that mattered. It was the practice, not the belief. Don't worry about what because I used to tell him constantly, I'm not buying into anything you're saying here. And he would tell me, you don't have to buy into it. You just have to live it.
Well, that's kind of that's always what I was told as well. And that's why I was a little surprised about that first thing, saying that, you could be the sinner and still get into heaven as long as you believe. To me, I was kind of
The opposite. That's the opposite. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, but when he wrote that, he was immature at the time. And, he thought you could just make up dogma. You can't tell, I don't think you can tell someone to believe something. I think belief comes from I don't know where, but somewhere inside of you. And you can't be instructed to believe. Maybe I'm wrong, but I really don't think that's true.
Well, you're wearing your 21st century hat.
Even 20th.
Okay. And I wear the same hat. I'm with you. Okay. There are two schools of thought here. That's why this is an interesting conversation. Right? But from a populist point of view, it made its way into the prayer book. Prayer book is theology. I mean, we don't sing it here very often, and I don't know what the history of that is, of why we don't conclude Friday night services usually with Yigdal. But around the world, this is one of the most popular statements, pieces of poetry ever written. And it's not some kitschy song. It's a very deep philosophical statement. And we're going to look at what it says next week. Right? But there are clearly two schools of thought. Well, I would three. There are those who say there's no creed. Jerry, it's what you do. There are those who say there's a creed and it's Maimonides' creed. And there are those who say there's a creed and I got to modify Maimonides. All those thoughts are out there. Avi?
I'm thinking about what you just said, Jerry, and I'm wondering that you can't make someone believe something. But I'm thinking about this idea that we are told that we need to remember things. We need to remember that we were slaves in Egypt, let's say, and yet none of us actually were there. And so the invocation that we need to remember is kind of a national or cultural thing. We, as a culture, we need to remember. We need to pass it on. We need to somehow, and in a sense, then, even though we weren't there, we remember. And I'm wondering whether, in that same way, is there a sense that culturally or nationally we believe certain things in the same way that we remember certain things?
Well, by remembering certain specific things, or by making them core memories, you're probably affecting what you will ultimately believe as well. Choosing to remember certain things may impact what your belief system is.
So I'm going to conclude by telling you two different things. So do you all know what the Orthodox Union is, the OU? Right? When you go and you buy, your can of tuna fish, you're looking for their symbol on it, their kashrut symbol, right? They're the organization that supervises kashrut, organizes all the Orthodox synagogues. They were founded in 1898. They've been around for 120 years. In their organizing pamphlet that talked about why they exist and what their purpose is, they wrote in their opening paragraph of their mission statement, we affirm our adherence to the 13 principles of Maimonides.
Wow.
That's a pretty good statement of endorsement. But now I want to contradict that Anyone here from time to time daven in Lubavitch Synagogue? Go to Lubavitch Synagogue? Myra, I think you do, right? From time to time? Anybody ever go to Lubavitch? Are there Hasidic sects to go daven?
I've been there.
I've been there.
Right, you've been there, right? So you go look through their prayer book. And you go ask the rabbi, what page is Yigdal on? And you know what he's going to say?
There.
He says, it's not here.
They don't like him.
He'll actually get very angry, right? Because what they want to say is, we accept Kabbalah. We accept mysticism. And since Maimonides did it, it didn't. So they leave it out very consciously. That's their polemic. So that's a little bit about the context for Yigdal. You'll vote later whether you think it's a creed or not, to go and do that. It certainly had a context. We certainly had a creed. We're going to read it in the Torah this week. Avi, are you reading Torah this week by any chance? No, right?
It is my favorite line, though.
Oh, Jerry, you're reading Torah?
Some, yeah.
Right. So it's in this week's Torah portion about being Mamlechet Kohanim Am Kadosh, to go and do that. Okay, folks, thanks for joining. And we
Thank you. Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Very
Next week.
interesting.
Next week, it's the same, Bart, it's the same link.
Yes.
Family.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I had a problem. Okay, thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm gonna go and look up the definition of creed. Bye.